Hello and welcome back to Buggleskelly Station and to the ultimate idiot's guide to model railway scales and gauges.
Excuse me?
Yes?
Is that a guide for ultimate idiots, or are you the idiot giving the ultimate guide?
Today I'm going to try and demystify the often confusing world of model railway scales and gauges. If you're starting out in the hobby, or if you just want a better idea of what the different numbers mean, hopefully this video will help. And later on, I'm going to talk to lots of friends in the model railway world to help you work out which scale or gauge is best for you. So what exactly is scale? Well, scale is a ratio which compares your model to real life. Now, this is real life. This is 1-to-1 scale, and your 1-to-1 scale. And I'm probably slightly bigger than 1-to-1 scale, but we are the standard, so we're 1-to-1. Now, something like this is 1-to-76 scale. So what you're looking at is a model that is 76 times smaller than real life. You might also hear 1-to-76 scale being referred to as 4mm, or 4 millimeters to the foot, which means that 4mm on the model equates to 1 foot in real life.
Why is it 4 millimeters to the foot? You're mixing metric and imperial.
Well, yes, but let's not get into that right now. You'll find lots of things in railway modelling go back decades, and so terminology can confuse things a bit. The important thing to remember is that every measurement on the 1-to-76 scale model is 76 times smaller than on the real wagon. Can I continue? If we go to a larger scale, then this wagon is 1-to-43.5, or 7mm to the foot. As you can see, this 1-to-43 scale wagon is larger than the 1-to-76, which in turn is larger than the 1-to-148 scale wagon. So working up from the smallest to largest, we have 1-to-148, or 2mm to the foot. Then approximately twice the size is 1-to-76.2, or 4mm to the foot, and then 1-to-43.5, or 7mm to the foot. And then finally 1-to-1, or 304.8mm to the foot. But nobody would refer to it as that because that's just stupid. Now, in railway modelling, you're more likely to hear these referred to by their gauge, with often no mention of the scale. So we have an N gauge model, a O gauge model, and an O gauge model. So what is gauge? You'll often hear people use the terms O scale and O gauge interchangeably, but there is quite a significant difference. As we've discussed, scale refers to the difference between the model and real life, whereas gauge refers to the width between the tracks. Let's start with real life. This is standard gauge track in 1-to-1 scale. Now, in the UK and most of the world, standard gauge measures 4 foot 8.5 inches. You'll often hear this referred to as the 4 foot, that's what railway people call it. There's also narrow gauge, which refers to any 1-to-1 scale track that's smaller than standard gauge. For example, the Talyllyn Railway in Wales is a narrow gauge railway, where the track gauge isn't 4 foot 8, but 2 foot 3, which allows the trains to traverse tighter curves. They're often built in mountainous areas or places where it'd be too costly or dangerous to work in standard gauge. There are even narrower gauges too, including the Romney Hythe Dymchurch Railway, which has a gauge of only 15 inches, and is definitely not built for people like me. Now, when we move back to model trains, this is a 4mm to the foot standard gauge. We call this O gauge, and it has a width of 16.5mm. This is a scale model of standard gauge track, and O is the most common modelling gauge in the UK. There are infinite scales, which we will touch on, but if you're looking at model railways, there are a few common standard track gauges that you need to get your head round first. Here we have N gauge with a width of 9mm, TT gauge with a width of 12mm, double O gauge with a width of 16.5mm and O gauge with a width of 32mm. Their respective scales are 1:148, 1:120, 1:76.2 and 1:43.5.
But my American friend says that N gauge is 1:160.
Ah, yes. Well, that's one thing to remember. Around the world, some of these gauges may have slightly different scales. US N gauge has a scale ratio of 1:160. Japanese N gauge has a scale ratio of 1:150, and here in the UK, British N gauge has a scale ratio of 1:148. So they're three slightly different scales, but they all use the same N gauge track with a width of 9mm. Remember, N for 9. And US O gauge models have a scale ratio of 1:48, which is slightly smaller than British O gauge models in 1:43.5. Similarly, double O is the most common gauge in the UK, with a scale ratio of 1:76.2. But for most of the world, it's HO, with a scale ratio of 1:87. HO and double O both run on the same gauge track, with a width of 16.5mm. All this means is that you could run an HO model alongside your double O models, but the HO might look a bit too small because it's 87 times smaller than real life and not 76 times smaller than with double O. If you'd like a deeper dive into why double O and HO differ, and the history behind it, then my friend Steve, the British Railroader, he has an excellent video on the subject, so please go and argue in his comment section.
Are you also going to mention that double O is inaccurate compared to HO, which is more accurate to true scale? In a true 4mm to the foot measurement, double O track should measure near an 18mm rather than 16.5. The double O gauge track of 16.5mm corresponds to a prototypical gauge of 4 foot 1.5 inches rather than 4 foot 8.5 inches in standard gauge.
Have you been on the special coal again? I was going to mention that, yes. In fact, none of the British standard gauges are completely accurate to scale compared to the continental counterparts. But there are options for modellers who want to go for more accuracy. For example, in 4mm scale, you've got EM and P4, which are both 4mm to the foot, so 1:76 scale, but they use a gauge of 18.2mm and 18.83mm respectively. There's a similar situation with British 2mm scale, which uses a 9.42mm gauge. Then there's the relative newcomer to the UK market, TT120, which is closer to a true scale where the scale and gauge are much closer to being accurate. Just to try and explain, at a scale of 1:120, or 2.54mm to the foot, standard gauge track comes out at a gauge of 12mm, which is much more accurate than the other scales we've mentioned. As I mentioned earlier, there are standard gauge and narrow gauge lines in the real world, and we can also replicate this in model railways too. These two models are the same scale, 1:76.2 or 4mm to the foot, but they both run on different gauge track. One is a double O gauge model, which means it runs on 16.5mm track, and this smaller one is 009, which means it runs on 9mm track. A 1/76 scale figure standing next to this loco looks perfectly correct standing next to this loco too, because they're both the same scale. You could also technically run an N gauge loco on 009 track, as they're both the same gauge.
Hey, that's me!
But the scale would be completely wrong. See how the figure now looks far too tall to get into the N gauge loco cab. Moving on up to 7mm to the foot, we have an O gauge model, which is 1:43.5 scale, and an O 16.5 or NG7 model, which again is the same scale of 1:43.5. A 1:43.5 scale figure stood next to the O gauge loco looks correct standing next to the O 16.5 or NG7, I'm just going to say NG7 isn't just a Nottinghamshire postcode, by the way. It's a new name for 16.5 scale, so you might hear them used interchangeably. It's just another one of those things to confuse you. As with 009 and N gauge, you'll see that 16.5 and 00 both have the same track gauge, despite being different scales. As I keep mentioning, the most common gauge in the UK is 00 gauge, and most common around the world is HO. But there's a whole world of other gauges out there to explore. T gauge is the smallest gauge with working trains, with a track width of just 3mm, and it has a scale ratio of 1 to 450. So that means it's 450 times smaller than real life. It means that this model of the Forth Bridge, which is amazing, is 1.5 miles long in reality, but it's been able to be built in just a few feet. Z gauge is about twice the size of T, with a track width of 6.5mm. The scale is 1 to 220, and this is more popular in continental Europe, but I've found, as I sell buildings, British outline buildings, in Z gauge, I'm seeing a rise in popularity in the UK too. Then we have N with a gauge of 9mm, and TT120 with a 12mm gauge. TT gauge has a scale ratio of 1 to 120, and although it's been around for a long time, it's seen a resurgence in the UK, over the past couple of years, because Hornby and Pico have launched their TT120 ranges. But what I would recommend is checking out my friend Peachy TT120. He's on YouTube and Facebook. If you want to learn more about TT120, because as he will keep telling you, it's becoming more and more popular all the time, so it's definitely one to look into. Then we have 00 with a gauge of 16.5 and O with a gauge of 32mm.
I don't like being used as a prop.
If you've got the space indoors, or most likely outdoors in a garden railway, we can get onto the larger scales. Gauge 1 is 1 to 32 scale, has a track gauge of 44.45mm. The original Thomas the Tank Engine series was filmed using gauge 1 models. As you can see from behind the scene photos, just how large the sets had to be to accommodate them. And then we have G, which is a common garden railway scale, a 1 to 22.5 scale, and we can add into the mix, the less common gauges that we find around the world, including S, British TT3. As you can see, there's plenty to choose from. I've actually added some tools onto my website which might be useful. They're scale converters, which will let you convert measurements between scales. You can also measure real-world objects, convert them to the scale that you're working in, and calculate the real-world size of a model, so you can find the percentage difference between scales. So please take a look at my website and you might find them useful. So if you've watched this far, you're probably none the wiser about which of these scales or gauges is best for you. If you're a modeller in the UK, you might decide to opt for a gauge with the most availability on the market right now, and that really brings us down to these options: N gauge, TT120, 00 gauge or 009, and O gauge or 016.5 NG7. Each gauge has its advantages and disadvantages, and to choose for yourself, you need to think smart.
Firstly, space. So how much space do you have available for your model railway? Have you got an entire railway room? Are you looking to build something on a dining room table or something you can put on a shelf? Then money. How much are you budgeting for your hobby? If you're looking at any brand new model, in any scale, you're looking at over £100 for a basic sort of tank engine. So obviously you can look down the second-hand routes. You'll find more bargains in, say, 00 than you will in O gauge, so that's something to consider. Availability. Again, this comes down to what you're wanting to model. So if there's a prototype out there that's only available in a certain scale, you might want to go down that route and look at that scale. Realism. So as we've discussed, certain gauges are compromised, like 00 gauge and British N gauge, whereas something like TT120 is an accurate scale and gauge, so that's something else to consider. And finally, time.
how long have you got to build a model railway? Are you wanting to spend years on this, or is this something you want to just plug in and play? Because obviously there's some scales where you can do that. You can buy things ready-made, off the shelf, buildings, people, scenery, and you're good to go. Whereas some scales are a little bit more specialised, so they will take a bit more time. Before I give you my thoughts on which scale or gauge to model in, I've asked a few friends in the model railway world to answer the question. If you were starting out as a railway modeller today, what scale or gauge would you choose and why?
Model train friends.
Cool. Can I just crunch my Werther's original?
As you can see, I model in 00 gauge, and that's because the majority of the stock I want to run is widely available in 00. However, I think given the chance to restart again and pick up a scale that I think suits the space I have and what I eventually would want to fit into a model railway, I think if the stock was available, I'd probably start with TT. TT is obviously a very new scale, and I think what's available for it is good, but it doesn't have what I really want to run. So I think over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, I'd really like to see a lot more of the diesels, the BR stock, the Network Southeast stock. And hopefully, if that happens, maybe one day I'll end up selling all of this and switching to TT. Having seen it at exhibitions recently, I think the scale is perfect for what you want. You have that halfway between N gauge and 00 gauge where you can fit a lot more in there, but you're not completely lost on the detail. The Class 50s look fantastic, and the 37 that's on the way looks great as well. I just hope that one day we'll get some multiple units, and I'd be absolutely made up with that.
So if I was starting again in model railways today and I had to pick a scale or a gauge, I think I would still go for 00 gauge because my primary interest is in small industrial locos, and 00 just by far has the most choice when it comes to that niche. However, for a more sort of general kind of opinion, and especially for those of you who are perhaps limited on space, 009 and TT120 are really worth considering. TT for those of you who want to model a more standard mainline approach to your layout, or 009 for those of you who want something a bit more quirky.
I think if I was coming into it today, as in today, I probably would have to chicken out and go for 00, just because there's so much choice available. People often go on about how expensive this hobby is, but actually, if you spend a little bit of time looking around for the bargains, especially the second-hand stuff, you can actually find some really good deals. So I absolutely would go 00 gauge.
So I'd go for N gauge because the amount of layout you can get in a small space is unbelievable. It's half the size of 00, and you can do so much with it. Proper length trains, and it looks so good. You can have the layout. It's a full scenic section. It's brilliant.
If I was starting out as a railway modeller today, I would probably make the same decision that I made 30 odd years ago when I first got started. And that is I would start with 00 gauge. Thing with 00 gauge, it is the most popular scale over here in the UK, and it has the best commercial support and the widest range of models. It also acts as a brilliant springboard if you do want to go on and do, like I did, model HO scale American railways or even continental railways. So I wouldn't change a thing. I'd start off with 00.
I have to say I'd stick with 00, I think, because plenty of options, plenty of stock available, plenty of accessories available. It's a nice, easy size and a great beginner's layout and gauge.
I think the natural response is to say 00 gauge. It's the most popular, it's the most common, it's the most well known. There's an abundance of second-hand models out there that can really get you started in the hobby. But if I was to be truthful, I'd personally recommend 009 gauge. And the reason for that is, firstly, it's 00 scale modelling, but it's not going to take up as much room because it's 9mm track. So it's like building an N gauge layout, but with bigger models that is going to be easy to see, particularly, if your eyesight is not as good as it once was. The added advantage of it is that many narrow gauge modelers, including myself, tend to build freelance layouts of completely imagined worlds of fictional railway companies. So there's no rules to follow. There's no, this wouldn't have happened, that wouldn't happen, because there's nothing more disheartening than putting all that time and effort into building a layout and someone coming along and telling you, well, actually, I think you'll find that that locomotive never ran on that layout. That doesn't matter, because, you know, it's your railway and you can run it how you like. The other added advantage is you don't need an abundance of track to build a realistic looking railway. Most narrow gauge railways were built to a single track. You don't need hundreds and hundreds of points for a massive yard. You know, most yards tended to be a simple loop or a siding, such as I've got here. And that makes it more cost effective, yet still simplistic and realistic. You can build a very, very simple starter layout in a 4 foot by 2 foot footprint. I've seen many 009 layouts built like that. And I think it's a great starting point to get back into the hobby, or to start in the hobby and really get an understanding of how things work. So that would be my recommendation, 009 gauge.
So if I was starting out, I would choose 00 gauge because the size is the perfect compromise between the smaller gauges and the larger gauges.
I'm still eating my sweetie.
So this is probably the boring answer, but 00 scale, easily. Or HL, if you're in the States like me. It's the most popular scale, and there's so many companies that produce 00 models. There are so many companies that make starter sets that make it so easy to jump into the hobby. And because it's so popular and so common, everything is made in it. You have way higher of a chance finding your favorite engine in 00 scale than in any of the other scales. And if, say, that engine isn't made in 00 yet, then there more than likely is a kit or a 3D model that you can print somewhere out there. The scale is very much supported by its fan base. It has a very, there's definitely an infrastructure to it, which helps and allows variety. I also say it's pretty economical space-wise. Obviously not as economical as N scale or TT, which are smaller, and you can definitely get more of a layout in a smaller space with those, but HO is like that perfect middle ground, I think, where it's, you can still get a decent sized layout on a board that you just purchased from a store. You can basically create a shelf layout or a loop. You can do anything on it, but it's also like not too small where it's fiddly like N scale is. It's that perfect in between. And I think like money wise, you get the best bang for your buck with 00 and HO too. Obviously the bigger you go, the more expensive the models are going to be. And the smaller you go, they also get more expensive. So 00 is kind of just like in that perfect middle ground of everything.
I think I'd go as conventional as possible and go for 00 gauge, 4mm of the foot scale. Really because there's so much available, both new and second hand. There's several different tracks to use. There's loads and loads of locos and rolling stock. There's buildings. There's the full support that you could need as a newbie. And you know, you might as well make life easy for yourself. So go for the popular one where there's lots and lots of stuff you can buy and you can fit in with loads of other people.
So I'll probably go TT, just because I find 00 is just a little bit too big to fit in this kind of space. It's just about okay. N-gauge is a little bit too small. The TT, I think, is just about perfect. More and more stuff coming out in TT now. I just think it'll be starting again at the 9 gauge.
I think that's a toughie. There's so much in the way of more choice now than there was when I did first start out. I think I'd be torn between 009 narrow gauge. When I first started railway modelling, there literally just was nothing you could get ready to run. Now there's a massive range from multiple different manufacturers. But I also really like O gauge, and I think with O gauge it's never been more affordable. There's a lot of great new models coming through from manufacturers that has brought the price down, And with O gauge, you don't actually need a lot of rolling stock or a lot of locomotives to have a great model railway. And for somebody with the eyesight that I've got now as I go into older age, actually the O gauge really would be a welcome break. But I can't break myself away from that 009 narrow gauge.
Double O. Why? There's loads of locos available, isn't there? So, I'm a loco guy. Lots of locos. Double O all the way.
So, for me, it's an absolute no-brainer. It's definitely double O. And don't get me wrong, there are some great options. TT, O gauge and N are all great scales, and I've seen a lot of great stuff in them. But for me, it's a definite double O. And the reason it's double O is, well, there's several. I think the most prominent one is just because of the sheer range of what's available for it. I started out in the 80s. Yes, I was very, very small, very young. But I started out in the 80s, and this was the first model I ever got. It was, or it is, I should say, a Lima Class 33. It's very noisy, but it's very simple. And over 10 years, I took this basic model and I learned how to detail, I learned how to paint. I put flush glazing in, and I took it from a very basic model to the model you see now. It's got cast buffers and detailing and all sorts of stuff, and it's still the same thing, but you could probably pick one up now for 10-15 quid. And I think just having all that range and all that stock available, secondhand stock particularly, there are some great bargains to be had in the store, on eBay, on various sort of trade events and so on. So there's plenty available for someone that's starting out. I can appreciate space is always a premium, and I think if you're starting out, it doesn't have to be a full-scale, full-track layout. You can start with a branch line, or you can start with I started out with a board in my bedroom that I put behind the bed Monday to Friday while I was at school, and then at weekends the board came down and I put it on the floor in my bedroom, and that ran around with a couple of coaches, and it was just a lot of fun. And there's a great community. One thing I've really picked up on in the last few years is just how good the community is. There's a lot of people out there who are really supportive, that are out there to give great advice and to basically make it really fun to do. So yeah, definitely double O.
If I was starting in railway modelling today, which scale gauge would I choose? Well, I would always choose double O because it's by far the largest range. However, if you live in a flat or a small house, I should investigate the new Hornby TT, which is ever expanding and is very good, or N gauge. If you've got plenty of space, O gauge, but you need a lot of money. But double O for preference, but it's really up to you.
It all depends for me on space and money. If I had the space and the money, I would start with O gauge. But I don't have the space or the money, so I've started with TT 120. Why? Because they're both pure scale gauge layouts and they don't look silly. It's as simple as that. I think double O and British N gauge are too compromised. We've been convinced that it's okay for too long. Simple as that.
So if I was building a new model railway starting today, I would probably go with a narrow gauge railway, either using 009 or the new and emerging NG7 scale. As a lad, I would watch Thomas and Friends, and one of my favourite aspects of that show was the narrow gauge railways. The locomotives were always so unique compared to the standard gauge locomotives, and it was something that always interested me. And as someone living in Wales, I was pretty much astounded when I learned that the railways that inspired the ones in the show actually were on my doorstep and I could go and visit them. And after visiting them, my interest only deepened. But then when I really want to model this, when I went to go and look at it, I realised the only options were kit builds. And as a child, I wasn't equipped to do that, sadly. But nowadays, I'm quite envious, to be honest, because the amount of ready-to-run stuff in 009 is amazing. And The stuff I'm seeing with NG7 is fantastic. And yeah, if I was building a new model railway today, that's definitely the scale that I choose and take advantage of. So yeah, narrow gauge. I will the layout that I've always dreamed of.
If I was starting out in the hobby today, I'd still stay with 00, just because it's the most apparent for somebody coming into the hobby, it's the easiest to find bits for, and the range is got the biggest appeal because there's so much different things. So you might go, oh, I like the shape of this one, I like the shape of that. You only really get that in 00, whereas O, TT, or N, it's a bit more limited. So O, 00 is more friendly. I like 00, it's easy to get hold of and also easy starter sets. Unless, if I was actually going to change, I'd probably start again in T, because then you could have a massive setup. Like, imagine this table with T. It'd take a week for it to get to one into the other. So I'd start again in T.
A massive thank you to everybody who took part in that. As you can see, obviously I interviewed people mostly in the UK, and we got 00 as the top answer. Now that makes sense. If I'd interviewed more people in the US, Australia, continental Europe, I think HO would have come out on top, because it is that sort of ideal size really, and that's what most people started out with, and that's what makes it the most popular. That sort of scale, around 176, 187 for HO. So my advice, for what it's worth, is to basically work out what you want from the hobby. If you're wanting to model long trains, big stations, N-gauge, you know, that makes sense. You can fit a lot more into a smaller space. If you're going for realism, which is a stage that I'm at now, I'm wanting to build more smaller, realistic kind of dioramas with moving trains, then O-gauge makes sense. And also it's better, you know, when your eyesight starts going as well. But if you're starting out, then I'd say do what I did, and that's start with 00. You know, there's no end of bits that you can buy, and you can pick up a wagon for a couple of quid. You can pick up a loco probably 10, 15 pounds, not on eBay and things like that. Go to actual model railway shows and trade fairs. That's where the bargains are. eBay tends to inflate prices now because people think they're worth a lot more than they are. So I'd advise go to a model show and pick up some bargains in 00. Currently, I'm modelling 00. I've got my Buggles Skelly layout. I'm modelling 009 as well, which is my Crovan's Castle layout. And I've just started an O-gauge. As I say, it's something that I want to do to focus on the details and the realism. So whatever you fancy doing, just go for it. There's no wrong answers really in model railways. Some people might say there is, and ignore them. You know, there's plenty of people out there. If you find, oh, I love NG7 or whatever they're calling it now, there'll be YouTubers out there who have been building that in 016.5 for years. So look up on YouTube for these channels, or go to a model show, even better, because you get to see things in real life. At a trade stand you can pick something up, hold it in your hand. It gives you a better idea of the scale and gauge that suits you best. But most importantly, just enjoy it. It's the best hobby in the world, and yeah, you'll love it. So have fun modelling, and thanks for watching. So trains this way.